Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, and welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, where we explore the many facets of compassion and how it intersects with our lives in meaningful ways. Today, I'm excited to introduce a truly remarkable guest, Monique Mitchelson. Monique is an Australian clinical psychologist with a deep passion for working in the field of neurodiversity. She's not only a dedicated clinician, but also a powerful advocate for neurodivergent individuals, particularly women and girls. As a neurodivergent woman herself, Monique brings a unique and deeply personal perspective to her work, which shines through in everything she does. She co-hosts the Neurodivergent Woman podcast, a show that delves into the challenges, triumphs and experiences of neurodivergent women, offering insights and support to those who need it most. Monique has also co-authored the Neurodivergent Skills Workbook for Autism and ADHD, a practical guide designed to help neurodivergent individuals cultivate self-compassion, live authentically, and become their own best advocates. Today, we'll be diving into her journey, her work, and the impact of neurodiversity on the field of psychology. So, without further ado, I bring you Monique Mitchelson. Okay, well, Monique Mitchelson, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it as well. I wondered if you could start by kind of setting the scene for us a little bit and maybe just describing neurodivergent and perhaps neurotypical as well, and perhaps give us a sense of what it means to work within the neurodiversity affirming framework.
Yeah, absolutely. So the term neurotypical basically just describes the majority of brain types, like brain neurology in the population. And then when we have a look at brain types or brain neurology that is less common, that is not forming part of the majority, it's diverging from, that most common or average brain type, then we would refer to that brain type as neurodivergent.
Hmm.
And the term neurodivergent comes from, or the term neurodiversity, I suppose, comes from the term biodiversity.
Hmm.
So when we have like biodiversity, we need lots of different types of plants, animals, flora, fauna, bacteria, like lots of different organisms coexisting in an ecosystem for that ecosystem to thrive. When you have a monoculture, the ecosystem doesn't tend to thrive. And so the term neurodiversity and the neurodiversity affirming movement is just about recognizing all of the diversity that actually exists within the human species and emphasizing that we need all types of brains in society for society to thrive, and that we all have, regardless of our neurotype, strengths, and we all have challenges and things that we need support with. And yeah, I think that's a really lovely way of framing, difference and also the importance of working together to form a whole and making space for each other in society.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's beautiful. It's sort of, I love that metaphor with biodiversity, I suppose. It makes it make complete sense, really. That the
Yeah.
diversity is absolutely a strength for just the world in a sense, across all kinds of flora and fauna and also within humans. Is there a sense that neurotypical kind of is sort of most or many people? Is it like a black and white category? Like when does it become, sort of a more neurodiversity sort of, category, if it's such a thing, or is it more across a spectrum? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I guess neurotypical is a term that actually came originally from the autistic community, just to refer to people that have that more typical, more common
Mm,
neurotype.
mm,
Whereas when we're looking at neurodivergent people, and the correct term is to say neurodivergent rather than neurodiverse, because neurodiverse and neurodiversity, remember, refers to everyone in that sort of biodiversity sphere, right?
Good.
So
Yep.
everyone is part of, the diversity present in human beings and our neurotypes and our brain biology. But neurodivergent people have, brain differences that are maybe not as common. And in the neurodivergent community, there is ongoing debate around what would fall in the neurodivergent range and what would be considered neurotypical. So it's not something that is really concrete or very black and white. So, for example, someone may be neurodivergent who has a neurodevelopmental difference. So, autism and ADHD would be really well known neurodivergences, but also things like dyscalculia and dyslexia, as well as tics and Tourette's. And then things that are biologically and genetically based. So, your brain biology is different, your genetics are expressed differently. So, things like OCD or schizophrenia could be considered within the realm of being neurodivergent and being part of that neurodivergent community. And then there's debate as well around acquired neurodivergence. So, for example, if someone acquires a brain injury, they may no longer be neurotypical. Or if someone, for example, goes through complex trauma, their brain may no longer function in a neurotypical way. So I think it's good that there's room for discussion. And yeah, I think it's kind of good to be talking about this on podcasts and things like that, just to explain the complexity and the nuance that is present. And when we're looking, I guess, at being neurodiversity affirming in that framework, it's about affirming the person's neurodivergent identity, because often being different, having a different neurotype, having a disability has been seen as a negative in society. And so a lot of the model that psychology and psychiatry is based on is the medical model, which is the most common model in like Western society. The medical model sees difference and disabilities as impairments or deficits, and it pathologizes difference. And the aim when we're working within the medical model is often to like have an intervention to cure or fix people and return them from maybe not functioning in a normal way or a neurotypical way to being almost neurotypical, or functioning, in a quote unquote normal way. So that can be difficult because I think the medical model is really more for working with things like depression and anxiety that are episodic. And you're working to help the person overcome their depression or their anxiety or stresses that they're going through, like their co-occurring mental health issues. But when we're looking at neurodevelopmental differences like autism and ADHD, you can't actually cure and fix them. And a lot of people still frame them in the medical model or as mental health conditions. And yeah, like that's what I was kind of taught at university. Like ADHD wasn't actually moved into the neurodevelopmental quote unquote disorder category until the DSM-5. So previously, ADHD had been seen as, like if you look at it from the 1800s onwards, there's been mention of ADHD-like traits in like medical literature, but it was seen as you were immoral, you were badly behaved, there was something wrong with your character. And then, there were maybe more behavioral interventions in like the 70s and 80s. So it was seen as a behavioral disorder. Then it was seen as a mental health condition. And now, with understanding that it's a neurodevelopmental condition, it's like something that you're born with and that exists across your lifespan, and that you may actually need ongoing support with. Whilst you have the strengths of it, you have ongoing support needs often across your lifespan. So I think it's really important, like, to unpack the models with which we've been taught at university and frame our understanding of working with people, and to really understand the influence of the medical model and how that may not actually be affirming when working with neurodivergent people who often have lifelong, biologically based differences.
Mm. Mm.
And the neurodiversity affirming movement is actually based on what we call the social model of disability. So, disability rights advocates from the 70s and 80s onwards have fought for disabled people's rights. And they basically have proposed that in the social model of disability, you can have physical, neurological differences that do make life harder. Takes you longer to do things, it costs more energy, certain things may not be accessible without support. But they also acknowledge that the fault, doesn't lie with the individual, and the responsibility of fixing you does not lie with the individual, which often happens in the medical model, right? But in the social model of disability, it actually acknowledges that there are societal barriers on all levels for people who are different, and people who, have these neurological or physical mental health differences are often not taken into account when the systems that we all exist within are built. And so I think something that's often not talked about in psychology and is really relevant for compassion focused therapy is ableism. We often talk about sexism, racism, but ableism is something that's not really acknowledged much in the psychology space. And that's because if you don't have a disability, you don't think about it. And that's part of the inbuilt bias that we all have, implicit bias, right? From
Mm.
social psychology.
Mhm.
So when schools are designed, universities are designed, workplaces are designed, there are all these invisible barriers due to this invisible and visible bias against people with disabilities or people who have more support needs. So it's harder for people to actually access like education, to access workplaces. But if you don't have those barriers and you kind of can make your way through these systems fairly easily, you may not notice um, those barriers because you don't see them, because they don't affect you. And so, one of the things I think is great to have a think about and reflect on is how many people with a visible disability do you see working as psychologists in our profession? Not many. Yeah.
Mm.
So, because there's all these barriers. And so I think
Mm.
acknowledging some of the biases that exist within society that produce systemic barriers and the effect that those systemic barriers have on people who are neurologically different or are disabled by these barriers. I think that's really important in getting in touch with compassion for difference and acknowledging other people's suffering. That makes sense.
Mm. Oh, Monique, you're a wonderful advocate for these things and explainer, and that even that sort of section so far has kind of elucidated things for me. It's really
Mm.
so many good bits that I feel like I want to go back to, but it does remind me, I suppose, of and we will talk about CFT, I'm hoping, a
Mm.
bit later too, but it reminds me of just that basic idea that we have tricky brains, in a sense, and
Yes.
that's what it is. It's there's a diversity there, and there's sort of it's part of the design, really. It's
Yes.
helpful to have diversity in the way that our human brains work. We bring different sort of things to the table, and that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and all of that sort of stuff is really
Yeah.
what's behind this idea of kind of seeing the real value and affirming,
Yes.
the diversity that people find themselves in. And sadly too, there's structures around, systemic structures or other ways that probably themselves have evolved a little bit, but they just create barriers, I suppose, in one way or another. And so the neurodiversity affirming kind of framework is really about trying to have have options, have choices, have different ways in, so that various people can still have experiences and kind of flourish in a way. And
Yeah.
it's interesting, sort of multiple ways to engage, multiple ways to sort of be represented, multiple ways to be able to express oneself, and all of those bits and pieces help with neurodiversity affirming. And it's there's a couple of little kind of specific questions. Like, one thing that came up when you were talking there at the start about, kind of what might represent a kind of a neurodiverse brain or person. Um, it,
Neurodivergent brain or
a,
person.
a neurodivergent brain. Thank you. I
You're
nearly
welcome.
said then. Do pardon me if I use some of
Yeah,
the wrong terms, because
that's
like
okay.
and I appreciate your
We're here to learn.
exactly. That's what I'm here for. Um, and I guess I was wondering about things like psychopathy, perhaps, or
Mm.
narcissism, or
Mm.
some other types that we might be working
Hmm.
with who themselves really have
Yes.
perhaps enduring qualities, characteristics to their brain and functioning that. Do we sort of include those folks in a neurodivergent kind of idea?
Yeah, that's a really, I think, an interesting point, because something that I think isn't often mentioned is the amount of diagnoses that autistic and ADHD people accumulate over their lifetime
Mm,
because their underlying autism or ADHD has not actually been diagnosed. So, for example, there was a study done that looked at the rate of autistic people being hospitalized for a mental health condition by the time they were 25. And they found that, yeah, nearly 25% of autistic women are hospitalized for a mental health condition by the time they turn
mm,
25, which is twice that of autistic men and much higher than that of neurotypical men and women.
mm,
And I do wonder that if you are autistic or, ADHD as well, but you're not diagnosed, often autistic and ADHD people are exposed to chronic stresses and traumas, and then they don't know why they're different. They don't know why things are so difficult for them, or why they can't maybe do things the way that other people do them or as easily. And yeah, unfortunately, people can get labeled with things like personality disorders. So, really common misdiagnosis for adult autistic women is having been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or
mm,
bipolar as well, when actually it may have been that they have complex PTSD and are autistic and ADHD. That's not to say that people absolutely can't be autistic and ADHD and also have bipolar or a personality disorder in addition to that. But yeah, I do think that there are forms of acquired neurodivergence, for example, like a personality disorder, that may be the result of trauma.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, like I got into working with trauma and would see in a lot of these family systems where there's intergenerational trauma, intergenerational substance use, interactions with the justice system, domestic violence, and traits of what looked like potential, narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder intergenerationally in families. And then over time, getting to work with clients, going, actually, you are meeting the criteria for autism or ADHD. And we know that this is mainly genetic. So, autism is about 90% genetic, and ADHD is around 70 to 80% genetic. So, if someone's autistic or ADHD, the research shows that it's likely that they have siblings that are also autistic or ADHD, and at least it's likely that at least one parent is as well. So,
Mm,
then we start to see this maybe pattern of people who are neurodivergent or have an unrecognized disability coping in perhaps certain ways, particularly in past generations when getting mental health help or any support was not accessible or was not even a thing. Like if you were different, you would have been institutionalized, basically,
Mm.
unfortunately, in the past. And then, yeah, like there'll often be patterns of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational neurodivergence, but often the neurodivergence has not been identified, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Does.
So I think there can be a connection, and it's important to be aware of that. But yeah, in the neurodivergent community, there is ongoing discussion around including people with personality disorders as being neurodivergent.
Mm.
And yeah, like often there'll be, lots of discussion around that. And I think, again, it's an evolving area.
Mm.
But it's important to look at, well, what is the rate of perhaps undiagnosed autism and ADHD in people who have been diagnosed with a personality disorder?
Yeah.
That I would be really curious to have more research on that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then they have demonstrated with psychopaths in studies that their brains are different. They do have
Mm.
differences in certain brain structures and sizes. So yeah, technically that could be classified as a neurodivergence. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's that's I think that's really helpful because again, just with my CFT lens, it really is born with tricky brains and then shaped by experiences, and that's what you're
Yes.
starting to really kind of describe now. I think is
Yes.
that yeah, it depends what happens next, and sometimes trauma or tragedy or even shaming and shame experiences and shame memories, experiences of being excluded or bullied or punished for things, all of that
Yeah.
as children starts to kind of create a bit of a trajectory for people, I guess, isn't it? And I think one
Yeah.
of your particular areas of interest and expertise is around working with trauma and
Yes.
not least for those who are neurodivergent. What are there particular adaptations or things that important considerations that you would suggest around trauma treatment within that population?
Yeah, so I would suggest that if you are working with neurodivergent people, and often, autism and ADHD are seen as more specialized areas. But if you're working clinically, whether it's in private practice or in, say, for example, a private hospital or a public health system or hospital, you will be having neurodivergent people walk through the door. Whether they have a diagnosis or not, neurodivergent people are overrepresented in mental health treatment because, unfortunately, both autistic and ADHD people have much higher rates of mental health conditions and risk for suicide, as well as much higher risk for substance use and eating disorders.
Mm.
So, yeah, I think this is why it's really important to talk about this so
Yeah.
that you can recognize when a client is neurotypical or neurodivergent and then bring that into your formulation and adapt, how you work with that person. But if you're working in the trauma field or working, specifically with neurodivergence, learning about both is important because unfortunately, there is a lot of literature that does support that autistic and ADHD people are more likely to be exposed to trauma, whether that's through chronic bullying at school, repeated experiences of discrimination, domestic violence, yeah, just unfortunately sexual assault as well. So there was a study that came out a couple of years ago where it was a French study, and in the sample of the study, 9 out of 10 of the autistic women in the study had reported they'd been sexually assaulted.
Mm.
So it's a pretty high
Mm.
statistic. And what some of the research around sexual assault shows with autism and ADHD is often there's victim blaming. So, going, oh, well, maybe the autistic person put themselves, in a situation that was risky or didn't read social cues. Same with ADHD, maybe they were impulsive, etc. But what the research actually suggests is that predators, um, they notice what's called a phenotype difference. So they will notice or pick up that there's a neurodevelopmental difference in that person. So whether it's they're an autistic person and they're appearing different, maybe because they're wearing headphones in public, or how they're socializing is different. And so the research suggests that predators actually target those who are more vulnerable, and disabled people and women and children, unfortunately, and elderly form part of those vulnerable
Vulnerable
categories.
groups.
And then also, autistic and ADHD people may be more socially isolated because of lack of understanding in society about autism and ADHD, lack of compassion in society towards those with difference. And yeah, like a lot of pressure for people to mask their autism and ADHD in order to be accepted and liked and make friends. So I think, it's really good to unpack why people are more vulnerable when they're neurodivergent. And to take into account, because I know in trauma therapy circles, there is often a big debate around, well, if they've had complex trauma in childhood, it's all of their autistic and ADHD traits are trauma traits. It's due to trauma. But actually, when you have experience and training in both, you're able to tease out what's the trauma symptoms, what's actually a neurodevelopmental trait. And rather than it being either or, going, no, this person can't be autistic or ADHD because they've had childhood trauma, actually, a lot of the time it's both. And I think that's really important to acknowledge.
Yeah, there's a lot there about the sort of unconscious biases, misunderstandings, misconceptions of therapists in a way, isn't it? That's what
Yeah.
you're working with is, how can people become, kind of really informed across these areas, and to become a specialist in trauma, for example, might mean that you sort of suggest that all these other symptoms are to do with that kind of thing, and being able
Mm.
to be very aware of these different areas so that we can properly formulate and understand
Yeah.
the kind of the processes that are really at play, and rather than thinking in very general kind of epistemologic, no, what is it, epidemiological terms. We
Yeah.
need to think about the processes involved for the individual, and kind of really disentangle some of that to properly formulate.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are a lot of myths and stereotypes about autism and ADHD, and it's probably only been in the last maybe 5, 10 years that there has been more research come out that is busting those myths, and more research come out that is also addressing the bias in researchers. So, for example, if you're a neurotypical person trying to study autistic people, you're going to be observing and analyzing, and asking research questions based on your neurotype's understanding of another group. So there's
Mm.
always going to be biases there. Whereas a lot more recent research is involving actually autistic people. So whether it's community members, whether it's autistic academics, and they involving community members and autistic people when you're studying that different neurotype and that population is important because often they'll point out things or explain things that the other person has maybe not realized.
Yeah.
So the questions that are being asked in the research are actually maybe more accurate. That makes
Mm.
sense.
It's funny, isn't it? Because it comes back to your original point, which is that
Mm,
neurodiversity, sort of amongst a research team, for example, is sort of greater than the sum of its parts too.
yeah.
It's actually useful to have those range of perspectives to sort of
Mm,
try to sort of reduce the chance that we'll miss things because of our own
yes.
biases and that sort of stuff.
It's
Uh,
unfortunate too, because bias can sometimes often result in people having negative experiences of engaging in help seeking, whether it's help
mm,
seeking with their GP, psychiatrist, or psychologist. So, for example, my husband is also autistic and ADHD.
mm,
And when we first went to his first psychiatrist appointment, his psychiatrist is, really good. We have a great relationship now, and is very good with adult ADHD. But when I told him that I was autistic, he dead set looked me in the eye and said, "Oh, no, you can't be autistic."
mm,
And I was like, "Oh, well, why?" And there was a few beats of silence, and he couldn't give me an answer. But
right.
I could see perhaps, this is me making an inference here. Maybe it was because of how I appear physically, so being an adult woman, being a clinical psychologist, there's
Mm,
again a stereotype that you can't be autistic and be a clinical psychologist, because there's
mm,
myths and stereotypes about autistic people not having empathy, not
mm,
having compassion for others, not having quote unquote social skills.
yes.
And there's also myths and stereotypes about autistic people, for example, that, if I was a 5-year-old boy with a special interest in trains, that would have been more aligned with the stereotype of autism. Whereas, a verbal woman who loves to dress in pink and wear makeup and get her nails done and can make eye contact, and her special interest is people and psychology,
Yes.
that's busting all of the stereotypes. So just watching his brain kind of explode.
Yeah.
And then after a few beats, he was like, "Oh, okay, well, I suppose you would know if you're autistic or not, being that you're
Okay.
a psychologist yourself and,
Yeah.
you work in a practice that specializes in autism." And
Yeah.
I was like, yes.
Yeah.
So
No,
that's just an
yeah.
example, I guess, of like a microaggression that for me, who has a lot of privilege, experiences, but a lot of my clients experience much worse when trying to
Mm,
seek help,
yeah.
unfortunately. And even though the practitioner can practice compassion focused therapy, you still need to actually work on reflecting on and unpacking your implicit biases for you to truly be an effective therapist and to truly embody compassion focused therapy.
Mm,
Does that make sense? Because people can be well meaning and try and say things that they think are comforting or compassionate that may actually be offensive to a person with a disability.
mm,
That's why I bring up this story, and I'm talking about some of these tricky things, and things that are
mm.
often not talked about in the field of psychology and therapy.
I don't know if this is me sort of simplifying because I am a motivational interviewing person, but like listening, listening well is
Yeah,
kind of almost key there, isn't it? Is to be
yeah,
able to, yeah, just to hear the story and invite the person to kind of, express themselves and to sort of not just to hold back on those kind of little judgments, until we,
yes,
or maybe never, but also we just wanting to learn more and know more. I remember having a lovely chat to your husband. I think it was at the, my TEDx talk maybe afterwards. I had
yes,
a great chat
yes,
with him there, and so that just popped to mind when you mentioned him a moment ago. But
yeah,
that one of the things that in CFT that might rub up a little funny with what you were saying earlier is our little favorite saying, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And you made a very important point, I think, that actually the sort of it's society's responsibility, that the responsibility is all of ours, really, that
yes,
it's not about just, kind of burdening the individual with all of that, but rather
yes.
what are your thoughts there about that often sort of quoted, phrase in CFT and how it maybe
Yeah.
fits or doesn't fit?
Yeah, well, I think again, loving this conversation. I feel like we're going on a real deep dive, like philosophically, which is
Yeah.
awesome. um, But I think that really strikes to the heart of a lot of therapies, not just CFT, that are more individualized or individualistic focused. I personally really, part of the reason why I resonate with CFT is there's an emphasis on not just compassion showing to yourself, but taking compassionate action, to make the world a better place.
Mm.
And I think that really fits in well with the social model of
Okay.
disability and deconstructing like barriers and taking compassionate action. I think as well, the point around being curious, reflective, compassion towards your own discomfort as a therapist. CFT does a great job of building that in therapists so that
Mm.
they can work with difference, and tolerate the discomfort of like working on internalized ableism because we all have it. But getting back to the point,
Yeah, that's great.
yeah, I think there's a real emphasis in psychology on, I think, yeah, like putting a lot of responsibility on the individual, particularly sometimes with more behavioral or cognitive therapies. Like, you need to change the way that you're thinking, you need to change your behavior. Um, and whilst I think it's important to acknowledge that people do need to present to therapy being motivated to be there and like getting the support of the therapist, but also taking action themselves. There is an assumption in a lot of the individualistic, more Western, psychology models of therapies on if you are not getting results from the therapy, you're not trying hard enough or you're not motivated. And that a lot of the psychology therapies, don't acknowledge disability and that some people actually have assistance needs to be able to access the homework tasks or to understand the concepts. So, for example, if you have a client that doesn't show up to sessions or they come really late and you ask them, what did you learn from the last session? And they're like, I can't remember like what we talked about the last session. Did you do your therapy homework? Oh no, I forgot. I think the tendency is to go, well, they're not motivated. They don't really want to be here. They don't want to change. They're not taking responsibility for themselves and their mental health. Whereas that person may actually have undiagnosed ADHD and
Mm.
they may not have capacity to do what you've asked them to do. And then you've made an assumption, and instead of actually asking, well, why was that hard for you? What are the barriers to you accessing this? How can I provide some support so that you can access this therapy?
Mm.
Does that make sense?
And the massive risk there is it becomes another shame experience for the person.
Exactly. Oh, I failed therapy again. Like, I often get clients who, like, I am the end of the line for them. They've tried all these other types of therapies. They've done ECT. They've tried
Mm.
10 different medications. And yeah, when they come, they're very hopeless. And
Mm.
I'm a failure. Nothing's worked for my persistent depressive disorder or my severe anxiety or whatever. And part of doing that differential diagnosis process is going, is this mental health? Is this trauma? Is this neurodevelopmental? Is there a hidden disability here playing a role in, why none of these treatments have worked for this person?
Yeah.
And again, mental health and disability are seen as something very separate in psychology. And a lot of psychologists often aren't familiar with working with disability. Whereas before I knew that I was autistic and ADHD, I worked as a disability support worker, 15 years ago. And I mainly worked with people who were autistic, who were non-speaking and would speak in echolalia, had co-occurring intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities. So I kind of learned how to work with disability, but it was outside of my training as a psychologist.
Mm. Mm. sort of ironic in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, so
That
you can
it
see how there's ableism,
yeah,
present
sort
because,
of built
again,
in, really,
yeah,
kind
to
of
therapy, it's
pervasive
assuming
almost.
that the person has capacity when
Mm,
that's an assumption, and it's an invisible assumption, and that's where it can become actually dangerous.
yeah. And I loved your point about CFT when really adopted or even embodied by the therapist can help a bit with that. Obviously it needs to be with intention and purpose
Yes.
that we sort of as therapists, bring awareness and action to the sorts of concepts that you're bringing up. But CFT and embodying that, the three flows of compassion, the fears,
Yes.
blocks, and resistances too, I suppose, all of that kind of sort of creates a platform for us that we're able to really
Yes.
approach people in a very open, open-hearted, open-minded, kind of supportive way. You, along with Jennifer Kemp, have recently published the Neurodivergent Skills Workbook for Autism and ADHD. Cultivate self-compassion, live authentically, and be your own advocate. I wondered if you could maybe tell us the origin story of that book, you and Jennifer, and how did that all
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah, so Jennifer was a fan of the Neurodivergent Woman podcast, which is the podcast I have with Dr. Michelle Levick, who's a neurotypical clinical neuropsych. And we met at my place of work, Redlands Psychologist here in Brisbane. And yeah, Jennifer just loved what we were doing with the podcast. And she'd previously written a book on perfectionism with acceptance and commitment therapy. And she said, look, I would love to help you any way I can to get the two of you to write a book on what you're doing because it's really helping a lot of people. And I think, again, with the podcast, both Michelle and I are big fans of compassion focused therapy. And one of the things that I think stood the podcast apart from a lot of resources was that there wasn't much out specifically on neurodivergence in adults and adult women, because there's an assumption that, autism and ADHD is mainly in children, and people don't understand that children grow up and become adults and still need support, and sometimes actually need more support because adulting is really hard.
Yeah.
Parenting is
Yeah.
really hard as a neurodivergent person, working full time is really hard as a neurodivergent person, right? And a lot of the resources around autism and ADHD previously have been more like deficit focused, whereas I do feel that Michelle and I were probably some of the first people to talk about what it's like being neurodivergent as an adult and as a woman through a compassion focused therapy lens. And a lot of people have told us they've never heard about autism and ADHD being spoken about in that way. And they feel really comforted by the compassion in the podcast. And yeah, that's what drew Jennifer. And Michelle at that time decided that she didn't want to write a book. And I always have wanted to, but thought, oh, that'll happen like sometime in my 50s or something like that. It'll happen sometime. And so, yeah, me and Jennifer decided to team up together and write a book together with New Harbinger. And it got released
Yeah.
on the 1st of July. And it's actually hit #1 on the Amazon worldwide bestseller list in the autism category within 2 weeks of it being released, even though
Wow.
our Australian supply collapsed the day after the book got released. So our
Oh.
Australian supplier was Booktopia. And
Oh. Oh no.
yes,
Oh no.
yes, it has been quite stressful, I have to say,
Very
but
stressful.
it's really nice to see that the book is still getting out there and helping people and helping, it's meant for professionals, it's meant for clients, it's meant for families, parents, partners of neurodivergent people. And yeah, it's practical and it's written so that if you're an ADHDer, it's not too long and tedious, and it has
Yeah.
practical exercises in it and is available on audio as well for a lot of people, maybe with learning differences, who a book is not accessible for them. and then it's available as an ebook as well.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Sorry to hear about the timing there of Booktopia. I can't
Oh, it's
believe it. That's,
terrible.
gosh, that must, your heart must have sunk when you sort of realized.
Yeah,
But
and this,
amazing results though. I mean, gosh,
yeah,
it's had a great uptake, I think, and it is,
yeah,
you know, just beautifully written and so practical. I mean, it's got a lot of heart to it, and it's also
mm,
got just this practical kind of element. I mean, for example, you know, like um, tools around or practical things around self-criticism, say,
yes.
and bringing self-compassion in there. Can you riff off that a little bit, or what's a sort of a practical tool example there, maybe?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, the biggest thing for neurodivergent people in combating self-criticism is getting a diagnosis.
Ah,
So,
yep.
when looking at autism and ADHD through a bit more of a deficit lens, people are often told, oh no, why would you want to go and get diagnosed with that? People will bully you. It means that there's something wrong with you. But actually,
Mm,
there's been a recent study, and there's some wonderful researchers in Australia who I think you've had at the UQ Compassion Symposium, and autistic academic involved as well.
yes.
And they've done a study, and they actually found that in this study, the adult autistic women who got their diagnosis in adulthood, one of the findings was that it actually improved their self-compassion because they finally understood why things have been so hard. It helped them to reframe all of their negative experiences, all of the negative comments, all of the social rejection, and not fitting in that they had internalized as this is my identity, this is my fault, there's something wrong with me. And instead reframe it as, oh, this is why I've had a hard time. Actually, there's nothing wrong with me per se. It's that I'm an autistic person living in a neurotypical world. That's why
Hmm.
things are hard.
Mm.
And it also enabled the women in the study, like one of the other findings was to enact more self care once
Hmm.
they knew that they were autistic. It's actually realizing that when you're autistic or ADHD, you're more at risk of burnout and you may need to pace yourself and also do things differently. And it gave them the permission to be more assertive about their needs and go, sorry, I can't do this thing in this way because it will burn me out or it will result in an autistic meltdown or it's going to really challenge my executive functioning. Actually, I need support in XYZ. So I think, yes, there are techniques, that we can look at, and there are practical things in the book. But the biggest thing is actually A, getting a diagnosis so you can have that self understanding, and B, consuming neurodiversity affirming information about your different brain type to counter all of the pathology and deficit based information.
Mm.
And the thing is, most neurodivergent people know that they're neurodivergent. They know that they're different in some way from early childhood. They know that they're not fitting in. And when you think about compassion focused therapy and that threat drive and the experiences that grow the threat drive for people, there's been, other research showing that kids with ADHD receive up to 12,000 negative comments by the time they're 10 years old.
Mm.
So you can imagine if you're constantly told, sit still, stop fidgeting, why are you so messy? Why are you so lazy? You're always late. You can't get your act together. Why haven't you done your homework? Stop being silly. Stop being loud. That's every day.
Criticism after criticism. Yeah.
Yeah, and often not being recognized for their strengths as well because of
Mm.
the negative focus and not being
Yeah.
able to do things in a neurotypical way.
Yeah, constant criticism and just this paucity of affirmation, and the
Absolutely.
diagnosis really can turn that, sort of in the opposite direction. All of a sudden,
Yeah,
we're sort of able to de-blame ourselves, to de-shame ourselves. That
yeah,
kind of attacking, condemning sort of narrative that was sort of sort of implanted, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
We can shift from that sense of identity and towards something else, towards something that actually feels, kind of affirmed, and actually,
Yes.
this is actually me. All they, and I can actually, kind of go forth, and live my life, look after myself,
Yeah.
and ultimately grow and flourish from there.
It helps remove the barriers to the yeah, that sort of more goal orientated drive and being able to go out and do things that are enjoyable as well, when that threat drive is being addressed. And then I
Mm,
think for a lot of neurodivergent people, they may not have actually received a lot of compassion from other people. People may be impatient with them or annoyed with them or judge them harshly for being weird.
mm.
I got told as a kid in primary school that I was Monique the freak and Monique the geek.
Mm.
And I reframed that and was like, no, I am Monique the unique.
You did that as
So
a child?
as a child, I'm like, no.
Wow.
And that's actually, I think, where possibly being autistic as well as ADHD was very helpful because I was pretty oblivious to the negative comments socially from other people until
Right.
high school. And then it
Right.
was like, oh no, this is really hard. Why am I
Mm.
doing everything wrong? And then learning how to mask. Yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah. Yes, no, it's powerful stuff, really, isn't it? And it
Mm.
really, when you think about and connect to the suffering that is often there for people through no
Yeah.
fault of their own, and
Yeah.
just through, kind of circumstances, and gradually things are happening, and it just creates such a toll.
Yeah.
It's a gift, really, for them to be able to see things, perhaps so differently now, and the yeah, it's really powerful stuff. You also have uh, authenticity and self-advocacy in the title.
Yeah.
Would you mind, yeah, just sort of telling us a bit about those, where they fit in for you?
Yeah, so I think with authenticity, part of what we address in the book is self-acceptance, because often people are kind of told that who they are isn't socially acceptable, they're weird, or they have weird interests. And so, yeah, I think learning that self-acceptance really leads to being able to unmask and be yourself because masking takes a lot of energy. And for example, like this, I think this is another good point in, some of the therapies that have been sort of taught to autistic people in the past. Often autistic people have been put through like social skills training. So
Mm,
learning how to interact with neurotypical people in a manner that is expected. And some of the more recent research on masking, so masking is suppressing autistic traits and behaviors and putting in a lot of cognitive, emotional, and mental and physical effort to, maybe making eye contact in a neurotypical way or modulating the tone of your voice so it's less monotone, like having the right facial expression on your face at the right time. So being socially appropriate. Some of the research around masking is actually shown now that people who mask their autism have worse mental health. So, more anxiety, depression. They don't feel like other people like them for their authentic self. So, they're like, my friends only like me for the mask that I put on. No one sees, my authentic self. It leads to more social isolation and
mm,
actually, one of the findings was increased thoughts of self harm and suicidality.
mm,
So I think that's where, unpacking ableism, unpacking a lot of the negatives and negative stereotypes and perspectives around difference helps people to feel safer unmasking,
mhm,
having people more aware of what autism and ADHD actually are and having more acceptance in society makes people safer to unmask and be their authentic self and feel like they can be accepted. Um, yeah, so I think we have a chapter on unmasking. We have a chapter on who are you, like underneath the mask, because a lot of people lose their sense of identity through masking for so long. And then we have a chapter on self-advocacy. And self-advocacy is hard because, you know, when you are already running on empty from just trying to function due to your difference or chronic health issues or disability, the extra energy it takes to constantly advocate for your needs and then get hit with people not understanding or dismissing or invalidating you is devastating. And whilst it's like we thought it was important to put skills in the book to teach people what to say, how to evaluate situations, whether it's worth self-advocating, how to do it, you know, successfully, it's also like important to acknowledge that society also needs to change so that difference and accommodations and people doing things in different ways is normalized. So, for example, a common roadblock might be, you know, you might ask your work, can I work from home 2 days a week? Because actually, the transition of getting ready and leaving the house, being in an open plan office where there's lots of noise and distractions, social chit chat in the lunchroom, you know, contributes to autistic burnout for me. And then I'm less productive at work because I can't concentrate because of all the noise and the people and the interruptions. Then you might have a manager say, oh, well, if we give this accommodation to you, everyone else will want it. So we're not going to
Mm.
do that. Or if we give you this accommodation, you're unfairly getting an advantage over the other workers when it's actually not acknowledging equity, that that person has a disability and needs an accommodation to be able to perform at the same level as everyone else. It's going, oh, well, no, you're asking for something extra and special, and that's not fair. So again, there are like these pervasive sort of beliefs society-wide that make it really hard to advocate for yourself. You know, and that's
Mm.
where it can be useful for other people, like family members and partners, to read that advocacy chapter because often people
Great.
need support with advocating for their needs.
Yeah. Yeah, so self-acceptance, self-compassion,
Yeah.
bringing ourselves to authenticity, being able to then advocate for our authentic selves, and also, you know, hopefully it spreads. You know, that
Yeah.
the people around us. Well, actually, what are your thoughts there? I mean, I know there is a lot of work to do and a lot of advocacy to do and so on. Is society shifting? Are there signs that some of this is starting to be more broadly recognized and brought into workplaces, for example, and things like that? Or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I do think society has shifted because the neurodiversity affirming movement has kind of been around since the early 2000s.
Mm,
And then it became much more well known in 2020 around COVID time because I think the lockdowns and conditions unmasked people's autism or ADHD.
mm,
And then there was a lot more media coverage with diversity of what does autism and ADHD actually look like in adults, in women, in people of
mm,
color, you know. So there's been more social awareness of it. And I think, yeah, there is much more awareness in the past 5 years.
mm,
And on a like legislative level, I was a consultant on the National Autism Strategy, so a lived experience and clinical consultant on the Diagnosis Services and Supports Working Group. And we're developing the National Autism Strategy for Australia to look at what are the priorities for supporting autistic people over the next 10 years in
mm,
Australia? Where should the funding go? What's important?
mm,
And one of the groups that they're looking at supporting is actually autistic health professionals and
mm,
researchers,
mhm,
and like helping autistic people to remove helping autistic people to access the healthcare system better and the mental health care system better. And doing a lot more training. So, normalizing training on neurodiversity affirming practice in health and mental health professionals. And
Mm.
that's going to come into effect at the end of this year. So the draft is out and the final strategy will be out at the end of this year. And then in Australia, the Psych Board has just released updated competencies that will come into effect in December 2025. One of the competencies is that psychologists do need to be aware of, cultural differences and actually be neurodiversity affirming and reflect on their own biases and
Mm.
adapt therapies to be suitable for people with neurodevelopmental differences. So, yeah, people are going to need a lot of training and upskilling in this over the next year because every psychologist in Australia will need to be competent in this area and demonstrate that competency. So, we're
Mm.
now seeing this movement and this growth backed up on a national level, which is so exciting and relieving to
Mm.
see as an
Mm.
autistic and ADHD psychologist. And for all of
Mm.
my colleagues, there are many autistic and ADHD psychologists in Australia, and we network and we support each other. We have community, which is awesome.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
connecting to community, I think is a really good point to bring up with CFT because it creates connection to your shared common humanity of people within your subgroup who've gone through similar experiences. And it's very validating, of people's suffering and different
Yes.
experiences. So I would
Yeah.
add that connecting neurodivergent people to other neurodivergent people and the neurodivergent community
Mm.
is really key as well. We
Mm.
can't heal in isolation.
Mm. Brings in the three flows of compassion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, there sounds like there's really very substantial structural changes that are
Mm.
afoot, and they've been hard fought, I think, and
Yeah.
especially thank you for the work you've obviously done and the advocacy work at the some of those higher levels, in fact, which is very cool.
Mm. Yeah.
And also the podcast is amazing. I highly recommend that. The most recent one I listened to was Compassion Practice, which was season 5, episode 10. So if anyone's hasn't yet listened to the podcast, yeah, go and check out that particular episode. And the book's fantastic. And yeah, congratulations, absolutely, on all of that. If people were wanting to connect with you or your work or engage with you a bit, I mean, there's definitely the book and the podcast. Are there other ways that people can be in touch?
Yeah, so the best way to contact me at the moment, because my personal website is actually down.
I did notice
So
that actually.
yeah, it's very unfortunate timing, to be
Yeah.
honest, but oh well.
Hmm.
I'm rebuilding it at the moment.
Right.
That will take a bit of time, but yeah, the best way to contact me is through Divergent Futures. So a
Ah,
couple of years ago, I opened a training company with my co-director who's another neurodivergent psychologist, and we do neurodiversity affirming training. So that's
great.
Divergent Futures. And we are writing my next book together,
Oh,
which is going to be focused on neurodivergence and trauma. Mm.
wonderful. Well, I'll put all
Mm.
of the various links in the description below, as they say, or
Yes.
whatever. But yeah, Monique Mitchelson, thank you so much for what's been an actually very enlightening conversation for me. I am a kind of an older psychologist in some ways, and I can definitely relate to what you said. Like my training was very different to
Mm.
training now, and so it's been very important for me to hear yours and others' voices. Just to kind of really watch myself and my own kind of biases and make changes. Not least to the language and so on, but also just to the sort of the perspective and the lens through which I might see everything. So I certainly have benefited a lot from your work, and I know a lot of people have. So thank you for being on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you, Stan, for your openness and curiosity and your authenticity. Yeah, I was just mentioning before that we were recording that my first training on compassion focused therapy was when I was the clinical psychologist registrar and I attended one of your trainings and found it
Ah,
really
wow.
helpful. Yeah, and Yeah, I could just tell that you are someone that kind of walks the walk and not just talks the talk. And that's what I look for, is authenticity. So thank you for
Yeah.
all the work that you've put into in promoting such an amazing therapy like compassion focused therapy, and all the work that you put into, things like the UQ Compassion Symposium, because I would really like to see compassion focused therapy continue to grow in
Yes.
Australia. And we really need this therapy and this practice as psychologists, not just for our clients, but for ourselves, so we can
Mm.
be, the best psychologists that we can be.
Mm. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you very much, Monique. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yay.
Yay. All right.